The throne room of King Adrian was a study in profound, eternal silence. It was a silence composed of ancient stone, priceless tapestries that had witnessed the fall of empires, and the weight of 800 years of absolute authority. Tonight, that silence was being ruined by his brother. "He's just so predictable," Lucian said, swirling a crimson vintage in a crystal goblet. At a mere 6 centuries old, Lucian still possessed the infuriating energy of youth. A smoldering glance here, a tragic sigh there, a casual mention of how lonely the centuries are. Duchess Elena practically melted into the Aubusson carpet. Adrian stood by the towering obsidian hearth, the firelight catching on the severe lines of his face. He didn't turn. "She appreciates gravitas, Lucian, a concept you find as foreign as humility." "Oh, I understand gravitas," Lucian countered, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "It's what you call your brooding. I call it a theatrical condition in desperate need of a hobby. My point is, you haven't won a woman's affection in 300 years. They simply surrender to the overwhelming force of your reputation, your power, and your frankly unfair cheekbones." "It is a strategy that has yet to fail," Adrian stated, his voice a low baritone that could command armies. "Exactly! It's not a strategy, it's a steamroller. You've forgotten how to persuade, how to charm, how to try. I bet you couldn't win a modern human woman without any of your tricks." Adrian finally turned, one perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised. "What tricks, precisely?" "No compulsion, obviously," Lucian began, ticking points off on his fingers. "No overt displays of wealth meant to intimidate. No leveraging your titles, your power, or your supernatural abilities. And absolutely no telling her you're a vampire. You have to win her as a man. An eccentric, ridiculously well-dressed man who's allergic to the sun, perhaps, but a man nonetheless." The sheer absurdity of the proposition was insulting. Adrian had negotiated treaties that shaped continents. He had faced down armies of stake-wielding fanatics. He did not try to win affection. He received it as his due. And what, pray tell, is the stake in this ridiculous wager? If I win, you abdicate the throne to me for 1 month. You will spend it in seclusion, contemplating your methods. Adrian's eyes narrowed. The thought of Lucian on the throne, likely redecorating in something garish and modern like Art Deco, was nauseating. "And if I win?" "If you win," Lucian said, draining his goblet, "I will cede my ancestral lands in the Carpathians to you. And, more importantly, I will admit, in front of the entire court, that you are, and always have been, the more handsome brother." That was tempting. The lands were valuable, but Lucian's public humiliation was priceless. "You have a wager, little brother. Find me a subject." "Oh, I already have," Lucian said, a flicker of true mischief in his eyes. "There's a bookstore downtown, The Bound Word. The owner is immune to nonsense. Her name is Nadia." The Bound Word was a pocket of chaos and comfort in a world that Adrian found increasingly loud and nonsensical. The air smelled of aging paper, ink, and something he vaguely recognized from a brief dalliance with a baker in the 17th century: cinnamon. It was cluttered, disorganized, and aggressively cozy. And in the center of it all was Nadia. She was arguing with a man in a tweed jacket who was holding a slim volume of poetry as if it were a dead fish. "I'm telling you," the man insisted, "Plath's work is fundamentally adolescent. All melodrama, no substance." Nadia, who was perched on a rolling ladder and trying to shove a thick biography of Catherine the Great into an overflowing shelf, didn't even look down. "And I'm telling you, Chad, that your opinion is a fundamentally adolescent take masquerading as intellectual critique. Now, are you buying the book to hate read it at home, or are you just here to stink up my poetry section with your bad takes?" The man, Chad, sputtered and left. Nadia watched him go, then muttered to a nearby stack of books. "And they say I'm the one without people skills." She was perfect, brash, intelligent, and clearly unimpressed by male posturing. This would be insultingly easy. Adrian chose his moment. He waited until she had descended the ladder and was wrestling with a fresh box of inventory. He moved with the silent grace of his kind, positioning himself against a tall shelf of classic literature, a leather-bound copy of Wuthering Heights in one hand. He did not speak. He simply looked. It was the gaze, a carefully calibrated expression of ancient sorrow, profound loneliness, and smoldering intensity that had, without fail, caused women's breathing to hitch and their knees to weaken. He focused it on her, a silent broadcast of Byronic torment that should have had her rushing to his side, desperate to soothe his immortal soul. Nadia finished slicing open the box with a box cutter, then looked up, catching his eye. She squinted, her brow furrowed, not in fascination, but in mild concern. She walked over, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Adrian remained silent, deepening the smolder. He was a creature of the night, a tragic prince of endless sorrow. "It's just," she continued, leaning closer and peering at his face. "Your eyes are a little red, and you keep staring without blinking. The pollen count is brutal this year. I've got some allergy drops behind the counter if you need them." His internal monologue, a grand and sonorous thing that had narrated centuries of history, sputtered to a complete halt. "Allergy drops?" "I assure you," he said, his voice emerging lower and more gravelly than he'd intended. "I am perfectly well." "Okay," she said, shrugging. "Well, let me know if you change your mind. And try not to lean on the first editions. Their spines are older than you are." She turned and went back to her boxes, leaving him standing there, his smolder extinguishing like a damp fuse. The first battle was a rout. His second attempt, a week later, was a tactical shift. From tragic romance to overwhelming power. The rules said no overt intimidation, but the sheer force of wealth was a language every human understood. He'd observed her admiring a book in a display case, a signed first edition of The Once and Future King. His agent had procured it for him that morning for a price that could have purchased the entire city block. He entered the shop, this time with a purposeful stride. Nadia was at the counter, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose as she meticulously entered data into a laptop computer. "I would like to purchase that," he said, nodding towards the display case. She looked up, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. "Hello again, non-allergy guy. That one's part of a display. It's not really for sale." "Everything is for sale," he said, allowing a hint of his true power to color his tone. "Name your price. I will triple it." She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. It was a gesture he would come to learn meant she was dealing with an idiot. "It's not about the price. It's a consignment piece from an old professor of mine. He wants it to go to someone who will read it, who will love it, not to some collector who's going to seal it in a vault to impress his other rich friends. I assure you, my appreciation for literature is profound." "Great, then you'll profoundly appreciate this," she said, reaching under the counter and producing a well-worn paperback copy of the same book. $20. The story's the same, I promise." He stared at the flimsy object. The cover was creased. It was an insult. "That will not be necessary." "Suit yourself," she said, putting her glasses back on and returning to her laptop. "Anything else?" He was dismissed. A king, dismissed like a common browser. He left the shop feeling a sensation he hadn't experienced since the fall of Constantinople. Bafflement. For his third and, he assumed, final assault, he decided to combine his previous strategies. He would be the tragic, mysterious, and clearly very wealthy patron. He found the darkest corner of the shop, the philosophy and existentialism section, naturally, and proceeded to brood. He let the full weight of his 800 years settle on his shoulders. He projected an aura of such profound intellectual despair that surely, any moment, she would approach, her heart aching for the beautiful, tormented soul before her. He held the pose for a full hour. Customers came and went. The afternoon sun, his mortal enemy, began to slant through the front windows, forcing him deeper into the shadows. He heard the rustle of a broom. "All right, that's it." Nadia was standing in front of him, holding a broom like a scepter of judgment. "I'm sorry?" he asked, his voice a carefully crafted whisper of pain. "Look, buddy," she said, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "I don't know what your deal is. Maybe you're a struggling artist. Maybe you're method acting for a role as a sad lamp. I don't care. But you've been loitering in my store for weeks. You haven't bought a single thing, and your intense staring is giving the collected works of Kierkegaard performance anxiety. We have a buy or buy policy here. So unless you're planning on making a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to take your exhausting personal brand elsewhere." Exhausting. She had called him exhausting. Him. Adrian, the unquenchable flame, the shadow of Thrace, the king of the night. "I am not a brand," he managed, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Could have fooled me," she said, and pointed the broom towards the door. "Scram." He was so stunned, he actually obeyed. He walked out of the store, the little bell above the door tinkling a cheerful, mocking farewell. He stood on the pavement, blinking in the encroaching twilight. He had been banished. He, a king, had been banished from a small, cluttered shop by a woman with a broom. The next evening, a visitor appeared at the bound word just before closing. It was Lucian. He browsed for a moment before approaching the counter, where Nadia was counting the day's meager earnings. "Good evening," he said, with a charming smile that was a cheap imitation of Adrian's own. "I'm looking for a gift for my brother. He's difficult." "Try me," Nadia said, not looking up from her till. "He's older, very traditional. Thinks charm is something you can turn on and off like a faucet. Recently, he's developed a strange obsession with this particular bookstore." Nadia finally looked up, her expression sharp. "Your brother. Tall, dark, and looks like he's perpetually mourning the death of his favorite poet?" "The very same," Lucian grinned. "He's a good man, really, just arrogant. So arrogant, in fact, that I made a bet with him, that he couldn't charm a woman without relying on his usual bag of tricks. Specifically, you." He let the words hang in the air. He expected outrage, indignation. Instead, Nadia's face, which had been a mask of weary professionalism, slowly broke into a magnificent, predatory smile. Her eyes lit up with a dangerous, delightful fire. "A bet?" she repeated, her voice soft. She leaned her elbows on the counter. "You're telling me that emotionally constipated mannequin has been trying to woo me for a wager?" "I'm afraid so," Lucian said, enjoying this far more than he should. "And you came here to tell me this. Why? Professional courtesy?" he offered. "Or perhaps I just wanted to see what would happen. He's never had to work for anything in his life. I thought it might be good for him." Nadia tapped a finger against her chin, a slow, deliberate rhythm. The smile never left her face. "Oh, it will be," she said, her voice laced with sudden, unholy glee. "It will be excellent for him." For 2 days, Adrian stewed. He had been defeated, humiliated, banished. His pride demanded he abandon this foolish endeavor and return to his world of effortless conquests and eternal brooding. But the bet, the thought of Lucian's smug face, of a month of enforced contemplation, it was intolerable. And beneath the wounded pride, a more disturbing thought emerged. He was curious. Why had every tested method failed so spectacularly? It was a puzzle, and Adrian, for all his faults, despised an unsolved puzzle. He had to get back inside the store. He appeared on the 3rd day, not with a smolder or a swagger, but with the posture of a diplomat seeking parley. He stood on the threshold of the open door, the invisible barrier of the uninvited holding him fast. He could not enter unless she permitted it. It was an ancient law, and one he was now subject to in the most mundane way imaginable. Nadia was behind the counter, sipping from a mug. She saw him, and her eyes widened in feigned surprise. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," and then immediately threw back out. "I wish to speak with you," Adrian said, his voice formal. "You're speaking, I'm listening. The acoustics on this street are surprisingly decent." She took another slow sip of her drink, watching him over the rim of the mug. She was enjoying this. He could feel it. He swallowed a lump of pride so large it felt like a cobblestone. I wish to apologize for my behavior. It was presumptuous. It was exhausting, she corrected cheerfully. But I appreciate the apology. It has a nice, groveling quality to it. He ignored the jibe. May I enter? Nadia pretended to consider it, tapping her mug. I don't know. My existentialism section is still recovering from your last visit. They're very sensitive. She sighed, a great theatrical exhalation. Fine, but you're not getting in for free. She pointed a thumb toward the front of the shop where a leaning tower of cardboard boxes threatened to collapse. My delivery just arrived, and the dolly has a flat tire. You want in? You're the new dolly. He looked at the boxes. They were filled with books, heavy and dense. He, who had commanded legions, was being asked to perform manual labor. It was the ultimate indignity. I accept, he said, the words tasting like defeat. Great, she chirped. Come on in, you ridiculous man. The moment the invitation was spoken, the invisible barrier dissolved. He stepped inside, the scent of paper and cinnamon washing over him. The words, "That counts," screamed in his mind. He approached the first box. He could, of course, lift all of them at once with a fraction of his strength. He could move them to the back room in a blur of motion so fast she wouldn't even see it. But the rules were clear. No supernatural abilities. He had to do this as a man. A very strong, very annoyed man. He bent, grasped the first box, and lifted. It was heavier than it looked. He gritted his teeth and carried it towards the back, his movements stiff and unfamiliar. He tried to use his speed, just a little, to make the trip faster. He misjudged. Instead of arriving smoothly in the storage room doorway, he overshot, careening into a wire rack of discounted greeting cards. Cards for birthdays, anniversaries, and get well soon fluttered down around him like pastel confetti. From the front of the store, he heard a muffled snort of laughter. He spent the next hour moving boxes. Each trip was a fresh humiliation. He learned about the treacherous nature of packing tape, the surprising sharpness of cardboard edges, and the sheer, deadening weight of popular fiction. By the end, a fine sheen of dust coated his immaculate black coat, and his dignity was in tatters. He dropped the last box in the storage room with a thud and leaned against the doorframe, trying to look nonchalant and not like someone who had just engaged in the most strenuous activity of the last 2 centuries. Nadia was there, leaning against a bookshelf, holding out a bottle of water. You look like you just wrestled a bear. He took the bottle, though he couldn't drink it. It was invigorating. Sure it was, she said, her eyes dancing with amusement. She began unpacking one of the boxes. He watched her, a strange new dynamic settling between them. He was no longer the mysterious suitor. He was the temporary and highly inefficient stock boy. He picked up a book from the box she was emptying. The cover depicted a spaceship against a backdrop of swirling nebulae. Dune. Is this literature? He asked, genuinely curious. Nadia paused. Some people think it's the best literature. It's about politics, religion, power, ecology, giant worms. You know, the usual. He had an idea, a new strategy, born not of arrogance, but of desperation. An excuse to be here, a reason to talk to her. Explain it to me. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. The mockery in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of surprise. You want me to explain Dune? I wish to understand its appeal, he said, choosing his words carefully. She studied him for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across her face. All right, non-allergy guy. You move boxes, I'll teach you about sandworms. That night, Adrian did not brood. He did not plot. He read. His advisor, Alistair, a vampire of impeccable taste and infinite patience, procured a copy of the book for him with a single weary sigh. Adrian sat in his vast, silent library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, and read about Paul Atreides and the spice melange. He didn't sleep, of course. He never slept. He had the entire night, every night. For the first time in a century, he used it for something other than staring into a fireplace and contemplating the endless void. He used it to do homework. When he returned to the shop the next day, he was prepared. Thematically, he began, finding Nadia shelving the new arrivals, the story is a cautionary tale about messianic figures, is it not? The dangers of charismatic leadership are laid bare. Nadia paused, a copy of a new thriller in her hand. She turned to him. Wow, you actually did the reading. I am a diligent student. You sound like you're writing a college paper, she teased, but there was a new warmth in her tone. Yeah, that's part of it. But did you get to the part with the Gom Jabbar, the test of humanity? The test of whether one can master their instinct through will, Adrian said. Yes, I found it uncomfortably relevant. Uncomfortably relevant how? He chose his words as if navigating a treaty negotiation. There are those who are ruled by instinct, by hunger, by the animal part of their nature. And there are those who choose in every moment to be more than what they were designed to be. Herbert understood that the test is not a single event. It is continuous. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's not a college paper answer. That's a real one. She handed him a stack of books to shelve. You're on the fantasy section today, alphabetical. And if you put Terry Pratchett before Terry Brooks, I will end you. They talked for 20 minutes more while he shelved. He was stilted, academic, analyzing the text as if it were a historical document. She was passionate and funny, poking holes in his formal analysis and talking about how the characters felt. It was the longest conversation they'd ever had. He left the shop not feeling defeated, but intrigued, and determined to read the next book she recommended. This became their new rhythm. She would suggest a book, and he would return the next day ready to discuss it. Fantasy, history, a modern novel he found bafflingly sentimental. All of it became the currency of their daily transactions. She gave him the books, he moved the boxes. They argued about literature in the spaces between. The first sign that something had shifted came with a muffin. Nadia had started bringing food to the shop on the days he helped. A paper bag with a pastry, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a thermos of soup when the weather turned. You work, you eat, she said matter-of-factly. Those are the rules. The problem, of course, was that Adrian could not eat. His body processed nothing but blood, and even that was a private affair, conducted with the kind of clinical discretion that 8 centuries of practice had perfected. A blueberry muffin was as useful to him as a decorative pebble. He accepted the muffin with what he hoped was convincing gratitude. When she turned to help a customer, he examined it. He could not eat it. He could not throw it away. She would see it in the bin. He did the only thing a vampire king of his ingenuity could manage under pressure. He slid it behind a thick copy of Infinite Jest on the fiction shelf. 12 minutes later, Nadia reappeared. Where's the muffin? I ate it, he said immediately. You ate an entire blueberry muffin in 12 minutes with no crumbs, no wrapper, and no evidence of chewing. She looked at him the way a detective looks at a particularly insulting suspect. Then she walked to the fiction shelf, tilted Infinite Jest forward, and extracted the muffin. You hid it in David Foster Wallace. I can explain. Can you? Because I'd love to hear the explanation for why my baking is being used as a bookmark. She broke the muffin in half and whistled. From behind the counter, her fat orange cat Marmalade materialized with the silent urgency of something that had heard food being divided. Nadia fed him the muffin pieces while staring at Adrian with an expression of forensic curiosity. You don't eat, she said. I have a restricted diet. Uh-huh. She filed this information somewhere behind her eyes, in the growing catalog of things about Adrian that did not add up. She didn't press it. She also didn't stop bringing food, which meant the problem escalated. The sandwich went to Marmalade. The soup was quietly poured into a potted plant that subsequently died. The slice of banana bread was successfully hidden in a return mailbox. But Nadia found it 3 days later when she shipped the box, and the postal worker asked why her package smelled like baked goods. She never confronted him directly. She just watched, with the patient attention of someone assembling a very strange puzzle. Then she invited him to dinner. "There's a place on Kirchengasse," she said one afternoon, not looking up from her inventory. "Italian, nothing fancy. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. My treat, since you refuse to accept payment for manual labor." Adrian felt a sensation he had not experienced since the siege of Vienna in 1529. Tactical panic. "I would be delighted," he said, because refusing would raise more questions than accepting. He spent the following 24 hours researching human dining behavior with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. Alistair, when consulted, simply closed his eyes and said, "You could tell her the truth." "That is not an option." "Then I suggest you learn to move food around a plate convincingly. Actors do it. How hard can it be?" It was, as it turned out, extraordinarily hard. The restaurant was warm, intimate, and lit by candles that cast everything in a golden glow that made Nadia's eyes look like dark amber. She ordered the carbonara. He ordered the risotto, because rice seemed like the most concealable food, small, movable, easy to rearrange into the illusion of having been consumed. For the first 15 minutes, he managed. He cut the risotto into sections. He redistributed it architecturally across the plate. He lifted the fork to his lips with impeccable timing, always coinciding with a moment when Nadia was looking down at her own food or reaching for her wine. Then she asked him a question mid-bite, and he had to either speak or chew. He chose to speak, which meant the fork retreated without delivering its cargo, and the risotto was returned to the plate in a maneuver so smooth he was briefly proud of himself. "You haven't actually eaten anything," Nadia observed. "I ate before I came," he said. The classic deflection. "You ordered a €20 risotto that you're not eating." "I'm savoring it." "You're sculpting it. You've made a small architectural model of something. Is that a castle?" He looked down. He had, unconsciously, arranged the risotto into what did somewhat resemble a fortification. 800 years of military strategy had apparently infected his fine motor skills. Nadia propped her chin on her hand and watched him, with the expression of someone who was enjoying herself enormously, but also filing this moment away for future interrogation. "It's fine," she said. "I'll eat yours too." "But Adrian?" "Yes?" "Whatever the thing is, the not eating, the not drinking, the not blinking, the way you flinched when the waiter opened the curtain and the sun came in, whenever you're ready to explain it, I'll be here." He looked at her across the candlelit table, at her patience and her sharp, curious eyes, and felt something crack in the wall he had spent centuries building. Not break, just crack. A hairline fracture that let a little light in. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than she could possibly know. She ate his risotto. It was, she informed him, excellent, and he had terrible judgment for not trying it. 2 weeks later, she sprang the coffee test. "Settle this for me," she said, placing 2 identical paper cups on the counter. "One is the good roast from the cafe next door. The other is gas station coffee I bought this morning for 70 cents. Tell me which is which." It was a trap. He knew it was a trap. His heightened senses could detect the molecular composition of both liquids. One was marginally less burned than the other, with a faintly different acidity. But he could not taste either of them. Taste required a living palate, and his had died in 1224. He lifted the left cup, inhaled, set it down, lifted the right, inhaled, made a show of consideration. "This one," he said, selecting the left cup with authority, "the better roast." Nadia grinned. "That's the gas station coffee." "I was testing your methodology." "You were guessing. And you guessed wrong. Which is interesting because anyone with a working tongue can tell the difference." She took both cups back and sipped the expensive one herself. "I'm building a theory about you, Adrian. It's getting very elaborate. I'll let you know when it's finished." He found himself smiling despite himself. "I look forward to the peer review." Her next book recommendation was The Picture of Dorian Gray. "You need this one," she said. sliding the slim paperback across the counter with a look he couldn't quite read. It's about vanity and the cost of staying the same while the world changes around you. He read it that night, finished before dawn, and instead of preparing his analysis, his usual armor of academic distance, he sat in his library in the castle as the sky outside began to lighten behind heavy curtains, holding the worn paperback, and let himself feel the book's weight. The eternal youth, the unchanging face, the portrait in the attic, aging in secret while its owner walked through the world untouched by time, collecting experiences without consequence, beautiful and hollow and rotting from the inside in ways only the painting could see. Adrian had no portrait in an attic. He had a mirror he hadn't looked into in 3 centuries, because the face in it never changed, and after long enough, an unchanging face stops being a comfort and starts being an accusation. Wilde had understood something that most humans didn't. Immortality wasn't a gift, it was a dare. Stay the same forever. See if you can stand it. Adrian could not stand it. He had been standing it for 800 years, and the only reason he hadn't noticed was that he'd stopped looking. He didn't go to the bookstore the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. It wasn't pride that kept him away this time. It was mathematics. Nadia was 31. She would age. She would grow old. She would die. And he would remain exactly as he was, standing in the same library, holding the same book, with the same face that had watched the Ottoman Empire rise and fall and felt nothing. He would feel this. He would feel her loss with a specificity that 8 centuries of careful numbness had not prepared him for. He would feel it for the rest of forever, which was an amount of time that suddenly seemed less like a luxury and more like a sentence. On the 3rd night, Alistair found him in the library, still holding the Wilde. "You're being dramatic," Alistair said, with the tone of someone who had seen this particular brand of vampire melodrama before and found it tedious. "Go to the bookstore." "She's mortal, Alistair." "Yes, mortals are. That is rather their defining characteristic. It hasn't stopped you before." "It has never mattered before." Alistair paused. In 600 years of service, he had never heard Adrian say that. He set down the glass of blood he'd been carrying and sat in the chair opposite his king. "Then it matters now," Alistair said simply. "And the question is not whether she will die. The question is whether you will waste the time she has by sitting here feeling sorry for yourself. Which, I must observe, is exactly what Dorian Gray would do." Adrian looked at him sharply. "Go to the bookstore," Alistair repeated, and left. He went to the bookstore. It was late afternoon, the golden hour, and he had to move through the shadows of the buildings on the opposite side of the street to avoid the worst of the sun. When he reached the door, Nadia was behind the counter. She looked up. She didn't mock him. She didn't ask where he'd been. She studied his face for a moment, the tight lines around his jaw, the way his hands were still at his sides in the careful way that meant he was holding something back, and said, "The Wilde got to you." It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Good. It was supposed to." She poured a second cup of coffee from the pot behind the counter. She'd started keeping 2 mugs ready, he realized, even though he never drank his, and set it on the counter in front of the stool that had somehow become his. "Sit," she said. "I'm not going to make you talk about it. But I noticed you were gone, and I'd prefer it if you didn't do that again without telling me." He sat. The coffee steamed between them, untouched. "I didn't mean to worry you," he said. "I wasn't worried. I was annoyed. There's a difference." She paused, then added more quietly, "The worry came on day 2. They sat in the shop as the afternoon light shifted and the shadows grew longer. She talked about the store, a supplier who'd shorted her, a book club that wanted to meet there on Tuesdays, Marmalade's ongoing war with the pigeons on the windowsill. He listened, not to respond, not to analyze, not to impress, just to be in the sound of her voice and the specific, irreplaceable present tense of her life. When he left that evening, she said, "Same time tomorrow?" "Same time tomorrow," he said. And it was. And the day after. and every day after that. His education continued. He learned to shelve books by author, last name first. He learned that a dog-eared page was a crime against literature in Nadia's eyes. He learned the name of her fat orange cat was Marmalade, and that Marmalade had excellent taste in literature. Or at least excellent taste in sleeping on whatever book Nadia was currently reading. He even dealt with a customer for her, a man complaining loudly about the lack of a certain political thriller. Adrian had simply stood behind the man and asked in a very quiet voice, "Is there a problem here?" The man took one look at Adrian's ancient, predatory eyes and decided he could order the book online. Nadia had given him a grateful, impressed nod. He was becoming part of the store's ecosystem. He'd forgotten Lucian. He'd forgotten the bet. His world had shrunk to the four walls of the bound word, to the scent of paper and the challenge of earning a smile from its owner. The new equilibrium was shattered by the arrival of Lady Serafina. She drifted into the store one afternoon like a perfumed storm cloud, her crimson dress a slash of violence against the muted tones of the bookshelves. She had been pursuing Adrian with the single-mindedness of a glacier for over a century. "Adrian, darling," she purred, her voice like velvet and venom. "I had heard you'd taken up a rustic hobby." Her eyes swept over the cluttered shop with disdain before landing on Nadia. Adrian felt a jolt of panic. Serafina radiated power, ancient and inhuman. This was a complication he could not afford. "Serafina," he said, his tone clipped. "What a surprise. This is Nadia. She owns this fine establishment. Nadia, this is Serafina, an old family friend." Nadia looked up from her computer, her expression utterly placid. She gave Serafina a polite, bland smile. "Welcome to the bound word. Can I help you find anything?" Serafina's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. She had expected deference, or at least intimidation. "I doubt you would have anything to suit my tastes." "You never know," Nadia said brightly. "We just got in a new shipment of self-help books. There's a wonderful one called Letting Go of What No Longer Serves You. It's been very popular." Serafina's smile became a thin, dangerous line. She turned to Adrian with a look that could have frozen rivers. How charming, a mortal with opinions. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a frequency that Nadia shouldn't have been able to hear, but Adrian could. "You're making a fool of yourself, Adrian. Over what? A creature with a shelf life shorter than your favorite wine." "Serafina," Adrian said, and his voice carried something it hadn't in decades. A warning. The temperature in the shop seemed to drop. She straightened, reassessing. Then she smiled again, all teeth. "Well, I can see I've interrupted something precious." She turned to Nadia one final time. "Enjoy him, dear, while you can." She turned on her heel and swept out of the shop, her fury a palpable force in the air she left behind. The bell above the door chimed, offensively cheerful in the silence she left behind. Adrian stared after her, his hands clenched at his sides. He expected Nadia to be shaken, or at least curious. Instead, she was just typing again. "She seemed nice," Nadia commented without looking up. He stared at her complete, unshakable composure in the face of a creature like Serafina. "Are you all right?" "Me? I'm fine. She's not my problem. But you look like you just swallowed a medieval artifact." She glanced up then, and her eyes were sharper than her tone. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said automatically. "You're not. But that's okay. You don't have to be." She returned to her screen, giving him the gift of not being watched while he collected himself. After a moment, she added, "If she comes back, I've got a whole section on boundaries and healthy relationships. I'll set one aside for her." He found it both utterly terrifying and irresistibly attractive. One afternoon, he decided to make a gesture, a human gesture. He had observed her daily ritual of acquiring a large, steaming cup of coffee from the cafe next door. He would procure one for her. It was a simple task. He entered the cafe. The overwhelming smell of roasted beans and burnt milk was an assault on his heightened senses. He approached the counter. A young woman with bright green hair and a nose ring chewed gum and looked at him expectantly. "I require a coffee," he announced. "Rad, what kind?" He froze. He had seen Nadia's cup. It was dark. A dark one. "Dark roast? Americano? Shot in the dark?" He had no idea what any of those words meant. They sounded like a coded message from a particularly inept spy. "The darkest," he said with authority. "One large dark roast it is," the barista said, mercifully taking charge. He presented the cup to Nadia with a flourish. "A dark roast," he declared, "as befits a serious literary mind." She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that did something strange to his long-dead heart. "Adrian, thank you. You didn't have to do that." She took a sip. Her face immediately soured. "Ugh, hazelnut. Why?" He stared at the cup. He had failed. He could smell the chemical sweetness of it now, a scent he hadn't been able to identify before. He could not taste it, could not know the difference. He had simply smelled beans. "My apologies," he said, his voice stiff with mortification. "I am unfamiliar with the nuances." And then she laughed. It wasn't a snort of derision or a polite chuckle. It was a real, full-throated laugh, bright and warm and utterly captivating. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "It's the thought that counts, you weirdo," she said, still laughing. "But next time, just ask for the house blend. Black." He had failed the task, but the sound of her laughter felt more like a victory than anything he had experienced in centuries. He was, he realized with a dawning horror, beginning to enjoy this. It happened on a rainy Tuesday night. The sound of water drumming against the windows had created a cozy, intimate world inside the shop. They were the only two people left, talking quietly as Nadia tallied the register. They had been discussing a ridiculously plotted fantasy novel, laughing about a scene involving a dragon with a fear of heights. The laughter faded, leaving a comfortable silence in its wake. The air in the small space suddenly felt thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with ancient curses or immortal bloodlines. It was something far older and far more dangerous. "You know," Adrian said, his voice softer than usual, "that dragon, his predicament is not entirely unrelatable. To be given great power and yet be crippled by a fundamental, absurd fear." Nadia stopped counting her cash. She looked at him, and for the first time, she wasn't teasing him or studying him like a strange insect. She was just seeing him. "I guess everyone's got their own fear of heights," she said quietly. He helped her lock the front door, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet street. She turned to face him under the warm glow of the shop's sign. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, clinging to her hair like tiny jewels. "You know," she began, her voice a low murmur, "for an exhausting, pretentious, emotionally constipated loiterer." He braced himself for the punchline. It never came. Instead, she rose up on her toes, slid her hand around the back of his neck, and paused. Her fingers registered the temperature of his skin. Cool. Not cold exactly, but cooler than a man who had been inside a warm shop all evening should have been. He felt her hesitate, felt the question form and dissolve in the space between them. Then she kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or conquest. It was quiet and gentle and tasted faintly of the chamomile tea she'd been drinking. For Adrian, it was utterly world-altering. 800 years of existence, of battles and balls and lonely centuries, all of it collapsed into that single, perfect moment. The universe had been vast and cold and empty, and now it was the space of a rain-slicked sidewalk, and it was warm. He had forgotten everything. His crown, his power, his very nature. He was just a man being kissed by a woman he cared for more than he could possibly articulate. A slow, deliberate applause broke the spell. From the shadows of the alley across the street, Lucian emerged, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. Bravo, brother! A masterpiece! You win. I concede. The lands in the Carpathians are yours. A truly masterful performance of courtship. Adrian froze. The warmth of the kiss turned to ice in his veins. The bet. He had completely, utterly forgotten about the bet. He looked from Lucian's smug face to Nadia's. The joy, the sheer, blinding joy of the last 30 seconds, drained away, replaced by a cold, sickening panic. He took a step back from Nadia, his mind racing. Nadia, he began, the words stumbling out of him. Nadia, I can explain. It started as a bet, yes, but it became something else. I swear it. He watched her face, expecting to see the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. He was prepared for shouting, for tears, for a well-aimed slap. What he was not prepared for was her laughter. It started as a low chuckle, then grew into a full, delighted, unrestrained laugh that echoed down the empty street. She laughed so hard she had to lean against the shop window for support. Adrian and Lucian stared at her, both completely dumbfounded. "Oh, Adrian!" she finally gasped, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of her eye. "You adorable 800-year-old idiot! You really think I didn't know?" Adrian's brain, a magnificent instrument that had processed the rise and fall of civilizations, simply stopped working. It was like a machine being fed an impossible command. Does not compute. Nadia turned her brilliant, laughing eyes to Lucian. "Thanks for the heads up, by the way," she called across the street. "Week 1 was a big help. Really helped me set the terms of engagement." Lucian's jaw dropped. Adrian slowly turned his head to look at his brother, then back to Nadia. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of such profound and beautiful humiliation that it was almost a work of art. The allergies, the buy or buy policy, the boxes, the hazelnut coffee. It hadn't been a series of failures on his part. It had been a series of tests on hers. She hadn't been a target. She had been the one running the game, the entire time. He stared at her, at this magnificent, terrifying human who sold books for a living and had just systematically dismantled the ego of a vampire king. "You're terrifying," he breathed, the words a mixture of awe and utter shock. Her laughter subsided into a warm smile. She stepped forward, closing the space between them again. "You started as a bet," she said, her voice softening, losing its teasing edge. "An arrogant, insufferable project. I was going to run you ragged and then kick you to the curb. It was going to be hilarious." She reached up and straightened the collar of his coat, a gesture so simple, so proprietary, it made his breath catch. "But then," she continued, her eyes searching his, "a funny thing happened. You actually tried. You didn't just pretend to read the books, you read them. You stayed up all night to do it. You listened. You learned what hazelnut coffee was, even if you still can't tell the difference. You showed up day after day. You wrestled with boxes and Kierkegaard. You put in the work." She poked him gently in the center of his chest. "That's all I've ever wanted from anyone. Not charm, not money, not brooding. Just the effort." He looked down at her, at the intelligence and warmth in her eyes, and felt the last crumbling remnants of his ancient arrogance wash away. It wasn't a loss. It felt like being unburdened. He had spent centuries being a king, a predator, a legend. She saw him as something else entirely. A man who tried. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of rain and old books. "So, the bet is void?" he murmured against her skin. "Technically," Lucian called out, having recovered slightly. "You still won the kiss. The lands are yours." Adrian ignored him completely. He pulled back just far enough to look at Nadia. "Does this mean I'm no longer banned from the poetry section?" She grinned. "You're on a probationary basis. And you're buying me a non-hazelnut coffee tomorrow morning. House blend, black." "I believe I can manage that," he said. He managed the coffee. House blend, black. He walked into the cafe the next morning, said the words exactly as instructed, and presented the cup to Nadia with the restrained triumph of a man who had finally deciphered an enemy code. "Correct," she said, taking a sip. "See, that wasn't so hard." "It was the hardest thing I've done this century," he said, and meant it only partly about the coffee. What followed was something Adrian had no framework for. He had experienced infatuation, brief, bright, consuming, and always temporary. He had experienced political alliances conducted through the language of romance. He had experienced centuries of women drawn to him by power, by compulsion, by the gravitational pull of something ancient and dangerous that they mistook for attraction. This was none of those things. This was slow and specific and entirely out of his control. It was learning that Nadia sang off-key when she thought she was alone, not well, not charmingly, but with a committed tunelessness that suggested she knew exactly how bad she was and had decided not to care. It was learning that she read 3 books simultaneously and never confused the plots. It was the way she talked to Marmalade in a voice she would have denied using under oath. Soft, conspiratorial, as if the cat were her closest advisor on matters of emotional significance. It was the small things that undid him. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way her handwriting changed when she was excited about something, bigger, looser, slanting upward on the page as if the words were trying to take off. The crease between her eyebrows when a customer asked for a book recommendation, and she took it as seriously as a doctor takes a diagnosis. He began to notice the architecture of her days. Coffee at 8, open the shop at 9, the specific way she arranged the front display. Not by genre or popularity, but by some internal logic he eventually realized was mood. "This shelf is for people who are tired," she told him once. "This one is for people who are angry. This one," she tapped a low shelf near the reading chairs, "is for people who came in to buy something but actually just need to sit down for a while." She had organized an entire bookstore around the emotional states of strangers. He had governed a kingdom for 8 centuries and had never once considered the emotional states of anyone. The first time he stayed past closing, it was an accident. They had been arguing about whether Hemingway's spare prose was genius or a cover for emotional cowardice. Nadia held the latter position with prosecutorial zeal, and neither of them had noticed the time until the streetlights came on. "It's 9 o'clock, she said, surprised. "I should go," he said, not moving. "You should." She didn't move either. They stood on opposite sides of the counter, the shop dark except for the reading lamp she'd left on, the silence between them no longer the comfortable kind but something else, something with a charge to it, like the air before a storm. "Adrian," she said. "Yes?" "Why don't you ever stand close to me?" The question hit him like a physical thing, because he'd been so careful. He had maintained a precise distance, close enough to talk, far enough that the cold of his skin couldn't be felt, that the absence of his breath couldn't be noticed, that the dangerous, magnetic pull that his kind exerted on mortals couldn't do its work. He had been so careful to be near her without being close. "I didn't want to presume," he said. "You're not presuming. I'm asking." He came around the counter. The space between them narrowed from feet to inches. He could hear her heartbeat, a sound he had trained himself to ignore in humans, the way one ignores traffic noise. But hers he couldn't ignore. It was faster than normal. She was nervous, he realized. Nadia, who was never nervous. "You're warm," she said softly, and then corrected herself. "No, you're not. You're cool. Like you've been standing outside in autumn." She placed her hand flat against his chest, over the place where his heart hadn't beaten since the 13th century. "There's no heartbeat." "No, that should scare me. Does it?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and entirely impossibly brave. "No, it makes me sad that you've been walking around without one this whole time and you never said anything." He didn't know what to do with that. 800 years of experience, and he didn't know what to do with a woman who looked at the absence of his heartbeat and felt sad for him rather than afraid. She slid her hand up from his chest to the side of his face. Her fingers were warm, so warm it was almost painful, The way sunlight was almost painful, a reminder of everything his body had surrendered in exchange for eternity. "I'd very much like to kiss you again," she said. "If that's something you're interested in." "I have been interested in very little else for several weeks," he admitted. She laughed, quiet, just a breath, and kissed him. This kiss was different from the first. The first had been a question. This was a decision. She kissed him with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to everything, thoroughly, precisely, as if she intended to understand him through the act of it. Her hands were in his hair and his arms were around her, and she was so warm, so impossibly, devastatingly warm against his cold skin. And he understood for the first time in 800 years why humans wrote poetry about this, why they built civilizations and burned them down, and wrote songs that survived longer than empires, all for the simple, staggering experience of being held by someone who chose to hold you. He pulled back just far enough to rest his forehead against hers. Her breathing was unsteady. His wasn't. He'd remembered to perform it this time, but only barely. "You're shaking," she whispered. "I am not." "You are. The immortal, all-powerful, mysterious, brooding man is shaking because I kissed him in a bookstore. I am experiencing a response I was not prepared for." She smiled against his mouth. "That's the most you thing you've ever said." They stood there in the dark shop, foreheads together, her warmth bleeding into his cold, the reading lamp casting them in gold. He memorized it, the exact temperature of her skin, the scent of her shampoo and old paper, and the last traces of the coffee she'd drunk hours ago. The sound of her heart beating fast, and then gradually slowing as she settled into the fact of him. He would remember this for the rest of forever. He already knew that. Some moments were built for centuries. The weeks that followed were a kind of education Adrian had never received, not the grand, sweeping education of courts and kingdoms, but the small, specific curriculum of learning another person. He learned that she stole the blankets. All of them. She would fall asleep on the couch in the back of the shop during late inventory nights, and by morning she would be wrapped in every available textile, like a burrito of unconsciousness, leaving him with nothing. Not that he needed warmth, but he found he liked the weight of a blanket when she was under it with him. He learned the topography of her hands, the callus on her right ring finger from years of holding pens, the small scar on her left thumb from a box cutter accident she refused to discuss because it was embarrassing, and the box won. He learned that she fell asleep fastest when he read to her, which he found both flattering and insulting. "It's not the content," she explained, already half gone. "It's the voice. You have a voice like an expensive hotel. I can't help it." She learned things too. She learned that he could hear rain approaching from miles away, and that he always knew when she was about to cry before she did. Something about the way her scent changed, he said, though he was embarrassed to explain further. She learned that when he was truly content, he became very still. Not the predatory stillness of the philosophy section, but a different kind, quiet and settled, the way a cat sits in a patch of sun. She learned that if she put her head against his chest where a heartbeat should have been, and waited, she could feel something. Not a beat, but a low vibration, deep and slow, like a building humming with electricity. She called it his engine. He pretended to find this undignified. He secretly loved it. They read together, they argued about books. She reorganized his shelves. He carried her boxes. He brought her coffee every morning, house blend, black. And she brought him nothing because he couldn't consume anything. And this became its own kind of joke, and then its own kind of tenderness. And then simply what they were, a woman who fed the world and a man who needed nothing except to be near her while she did it. It was, by any measure, the most ordinary and extraordinary period of Adrian's existence. He managed happiness, which was a thing he had not managed in centuries. What he could not manage was the secret. It lived between them like a third presence in the room, growing louder in the silences. She knew there was something. The not eating, the not drinking, the cool skin, the absent heartbeat, the way he flinched at windows and never took his coat off in direct light. She hadn't pressed. Not directly, not since the restaurant. But he could feel her assembling the evidence with the same quiet, methodical patience she brought to everything. He knew she was waiting for him to tell her. He knew he should, but telling her meant naming the thing that would change how she saw him, not as an eccentric man with strange habits, but as something inhuman, something with teeth. The accident happened on an ordinary Wednesday. They were in the storage room, reorganizing the back shelves, a task that had become their shared ritual, half work and half excuse to talk. Nadia was on the rolling ladder, reaching for a high shelf. She had one hand on a heavy box of hardcovers, and the other on the ladder rail, and Adrian was below, handing her packing tape. The bracket failed. The shelf, old iron, heavy oak, 8 feet of loaded wood, pulled free from the wall with a sound like a gunshot and swung outward. Adrian didn't think. He didn't decide. His body moved at a speed that was not human, not even close. A blur of motion that covered 6 feet in a fraction of a heartbeat. He caught the shelf with one hand. The full weight of it, 80, 90 pounds of wood and books, slammed into his palm and stopped dead, as if it had hit a wall. With his other arm, he pulled Nadia off the ladder and set her on the ground behind him, the entire sequence taking less than a second. The books that had been dislodged hung in the air for a moment, then clattered to the floor around them. Silence. Nadia stood behind him, her hands gripping the fabric of his coat where he had pulled her. She was breathing hard. He was not breathing at all. He had forgotten to perform the habit. He lowered the shelf slowly, leaning it against the wall. His hand, where the iron bracket had torn across it, had a gash that should have been bleeding. It was already closing. The skin was knitting together, pale and seamless, as if the wound were being erased. Nadia saw it. Her eyes were fixed on his hand, watching the impossible happen in real time. The color drained from her face. She let go of his coat. She took one step back, then another. "What are you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Not angry, not teasing. Scared. Nadia, who had faced down Serafina without blinking, who had banished a vampire king with a broom, who had never once looked at him with anything less than total composure. Nadia was scared. It was the worst thing he had ever seen.
"Nadia, please, don't." She held up a hand.
"Don't please me. Don't manage me. Tell me what you are, right now. No metaphors, no literary references, no Dorian Gray. What are you?" The silence stretched between them. Outside, the ordinary sounds of the city continued. Traffic, voices, a distant siren, indifferent to the fact that a world was ending in a storage room. "I am a vampire," Adrian said. The word landed like a stone in still water. "I was turned in 1224. I am 802 years old. I cannot eat, I cannot drink, I cannot endure sunlight. I am faster and stronger than any human who has ever lived, and I have been lying to you about all of it since the day I walked into your shop." Nadia didn't move. Her eyes were very bright, and her jaw was set in the way it was when she was processing something that didn't fit into her understanding of the world. He had seen that look when a publisher's invoice didn't add up, or when a customer tried to return a book they'd clearly spilled wine on. He had never seen it directed at the fabric of reality. "The not eating," she said slowly. "Yes. The allergy drops. Because you don't blink. Yes. The coffee, you can't taste it. No. The speed, the greeting cards, the way you caught that shelf just now, the way your hand—" She looked at his palm, now unmarked. "That's not possible." "No, it isn't." She pressed her hand over her mouth. She was shaking, not dramatically, not theatrically, but a fine, whole-body tremor that she was clearly trying to control. "I need to go," she said.
"Nadia, I need to go, Adrian. I need to not be here right now. I need to go home and sit with my cat and process the fact that vampires exist, and I've been dating one, and he's been hiding my muffins in David Foster Wallace because he literally cannot eat food." Her voice cracked on the last word.
Not with tears, but with the strain of holding too many impossible things at once. She picked up her bag. She walked to the front of the shop. At the door, she stopped. "I'm not running away," she said without turning around. "I'm running toward my apartment, where I'm going to scream into a pillow. There's a difference. I'll come back when I'm ready." The bell above the door chimed. The door closed. The shop was silent. Adrian stood in the storage room, surrounded by fallen books and a broken shelf, and felt every one of his 800 years. She didn't come back the next day, or the day after. On the third morning, Adrian arrived at the shop early, before dawn. He opened it with the key she had given him weeks ago, a small brass thing that he kept in his coat pocket and touched more often than he'd admit. He turned on the lights. He fed Marmalade. He started the coffee, the house blend, black, the way she liked it, and set a cup on the counter next to the register. Then he sat on his stool and waited. At 9:30, the bell chimed. Nadia walked in carrying a tote bag. Her hair was pulled back, and she was wearing the cardigan she wore when she meant business, the dark green one with the mismatched buttons. She looked like she hadn't slept much. She looked beautiful. She looked like she had made a decision. She stopped in front of the counter, set the tote bag down, and pulled out a notebook. It was a thick, spiral-bound thing, covered in post-it notes and bookmarks. "I have questions," she said. Adrian felt something unclench in his chest. "I assumed you might." She flipped the notebook open. The first page was titled in her neat handwriting, Vampire FAQ, Urgent. "Question 1, she said. Garlic. Real or propaganda?" He stared at her. Then, for the first time in a very long time, Adrian laughed. Not the polished, controlled sound he deployed at court functions. A real laugh, startled and grateful, and so full of relief it almost hurt. "Propaganda," he managed. "Good. I cook with a lot of garlic, and I wasn't prepared to give that up." She made a note. Question 2. Crosses and holy water. Decorative and wet, respectively. Question 3. The mirror thing. Outdated. That was silver-backed mirrors. Modern glass works fine. I simply prefer not to look. She wrote that down, paused, and looked at him over the top of the notebook. Why not? Because the face doesn't change, and after enough centuries, an unchanging face stops being a comfort. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she wrote something in the margin that he couldn't read and moved on. Question 7. You skipped 3 through 6. 3 through 6 are personal, and I'm building up to them. She turned a page. Question 7. Can you turn someone into a vampire? The air in the shop went very still. Yes, he said. Is it a choice? Theirs, I mean, the person being turned? It must be. An unwilling turning is... It's the closest thing my kind has to an unforgivable act. She nodded and wrote something. Question 8. How old will I look if I spend 50 years with you? Your age. I will look 28. And if I spent 500 years with you? Nadia. That wasn't a hypothetical. She closed the notebook. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. I'm not making any decisions today, but I'm not making any decisions without information either. And the information I need involves knowing what the options look like. She tucked the notebook back in her bag. Now, are you going to make me a coffee, or do I have to do everything myself? He made her a coffee, house blend, black. He got it right. Months passed. The shop settled into a new rhythm, the same and completely different. Adrian no longer hid the muffins. Nadia no longer pretended not to notice. He still couldn't eat, and she still brought food, but now she brought a thermos of something dark and warm that she left on his side of the counter without comment. He never told her what was in it. She never asked. The arrangement suited them. She'd started spending nights at the castle. Not every night. She was territorial about her independence, her apartment, her own space. But enough nights that the library had acquired a second reading chair, and Marmalade had claimed an entire wing of the East Corridor as his personal kingdom. It was a Thursday in late autumn when Adrian noticed the book. He'd come into the library to find her curled in her chair, a blanket over her legs, reading by the warm light of the lamp she'd brought from her apartment, because she said his lighting was aggressively medieval. The book in her hands was old, not one of his, but something she'd ordered. He could see the spine. Vampire, the Natural History of Immortality. He said nothing, but the next week he found another on the table beside her chair. Then another in her tote bag. Then a browser tab open on her laptop. Expected physiological changes during vampiric transition. A blog post, barely scientific but thorough. She wasn't reading out of curiosity. She was reading the way she read everything, systematically, critically, building toward a conclusion. He found the notebook again on a Sunday morning. She'd left it on the kitchen counter. His kitchen, in the castle, which she now called the kitchen, without qualifiers. It was open to a page in the middle. The heading read Timeline. Below it, in her neat handwriting, was a list. Not questions this time. Plans. She had mapped out the next 2 years. The shop's lease renewal, the inventory she wanted to finish cataloging, the books she intended to read, a trip to see her mother, and at the bottom, underlined twice. Talk to Adrian. Make the ask. Spring. He closed the notebook carefully and placed it exactly where he'd found it. That evening, she came into the library and found him in his chair, staring at the fire. She sat across from him and picked up her book. They read in silence for an hour, the way they often did, 2 people sharing space without needing to fill it. You saw the notebook, she said. He looked up. Yes? And you're not going to say anything? I'm terrified, he said. And I'm not going to say anything until you're ready. You'll tell me when it's time. You always do. She smiled, the real one, the one that made her eyes crinkle at the corners and made him feel like every century before her had been a rough draft for this moment. Spring, she said. Spring, he agreed. Outside the library windows, the city hummed with mortal life. Inside, a vampire king sat across from a bookseller who had dismantled his ego, reorganized his heart, and was now, with the methodical patience of someone who shelved books for a living, planning to join him in eternity. She hadn't asked his permission. She hadn't consulted him on the timeline. She had simply decided, the way she decided everything, with research, with conviction, and with absolute certainty that she was the one making the choice. It was, Adrian reflected, the most exhausting thing anyone had ever done. He had never been more in love.